It was the bell that woke me before the light did one of those hesitant clangs that seems to apologize for disturbing the morning. I lay for a while listening to it, faint through the damp air, echoing from some tower in the north of the city. Oxford bells always carry a peculiar loneliness. They do not summon so much as remind. I thought, as I often did, that the sound belonged to centuries of scholars long gone and only reached us by mistake. I rose reluctantly. The kettle took its time, wheezing like an asthmatic philosopher. Rain traced the window pane in thin vertical threads. I remember thinking it was the sort of morning when nothing should happen, when the world ought to remain half asleep. Yet something always does happen precisely then. The telephone rang as I poured the water. Strange how a small sound can feel so inevitable. It was Lewis, of course, speaking with that unstudied cheerfulness I never entirely trusted. There'd been a call from the porter at Lonsdale College about a discovery of the unsettling kind. He said the words with an effort not to sound eager, found in the quad early this morning. Perhaps a student, perhaps worse. I told him I'd be there shortly, though the thought of stepping into that drizzle felt almost immoral. A man should not have to match the weather of his work. By the time I reached Lonsdale, the light had ripened into that pale, indifferent gold that gives no warmth. The Protean elderly man, whose loyalty had hardened into suspicion, stood under the archway, holding his cap in both hands. He said the college was quiet, too quiet, and that the boy who found the body had gone back to his rooms, shaking. I followed him through the quad. The paving stones were slick, the puddles trembling, with the fall of water from the gutters. In the centre, near the sundial, lay the shape of a man in an academic gown, one arm flung out as if signalling to no one. A young man, face turned upward, eyes open but unseeing. The pale hair plastered to his forehead made him look like one of those drowned poets the Romantics were so fond of. Lewis joined me, notebook already out, sensible shoes squeaking faintly. He muttered about the porter locking the gates, about statements to be taken. I barely heard him. My attention had settled on the man's hand. It was curled tightly around something small, a bit of paper perhaps, or a fragment of cloth. I crouched, careful not to disturb the water pooling beside him. It was indeed paper-thin, folded and soaked through. The ink had bled into illegibility, save for a single word still visible in the corner bell. Lewis saw it too and said, "That'll be the chapel bell." I nodded, though something about the capital letter felt deliberate, almost accusatory. Inside the chapel the air was thicker than the mist outside, full of wax and damp stone. The bell rope hung motionless. A prayer book lay open on a pew, a single petal pressed between its pages. The organ keys were uncovered, as if someone had left mid-practice. I found myself drawn to the lectern, where a small brass plaque bore the inscription Resurgam. I will rise again. Oxford has a sense of humour about death. Lewis was speaking with the chaplain when I noticed the candle wax on the floor fresh, but no candle nearby. The drip pattern was irregular, almost as though someone had been carrying it while walking in circles. I thought of sleepless minds pacing at dawn, haunted by choices. We left the chapel as the rain eased. Students were beginning to appear in the cloisters, whispering. The quad had been cordoned off, and constables moved like figures from another century. I felt the familiar weariness, that sense of being both inside and outside the human play. Later, in the lodge, I examined the note again under better light. The ink, though blurred, was blue fountain pen, not biro. Someone still clinging to old habits. I asked Lewis to find out which of the fellows still used such pens. He grunted, already suspecting this meant a long afternoon. As we stepped back into the quad, the bell tolled once more. Its tone was deeper now, almost reproachful. I looked toward the tower, imagining a hand on the rope, unseen. It struck me then that the first toll I'd heard in my flat might not have been the chapel's at all. Perhaps it had been something else calling, something more personal. The day, at last, had properly begun. The chapel smelled of rain and candle smoke. Lewis said it was the same as any other morning, but I could tell something had altered. The air held a question in it, suspended like breath in the cold. The boy from the choir, pale as chalk, told us he'd come in early to practice the psalm for Sunday Psalm 130, as it happened. Out of the depths have I cried unto thee, O Lord. He had stopped halfway through when he noticed the dark stain spreading under the choir stalls. The words had broken off there, unfinished. The body had been removed by the time I arrived again, but absence has its own kind of presence. The polished stone still showed where water had gathered, and on the edge of the organ bench a small handprint had dried into a faint salt outline. I remember thinking how quiet the place was without the boy's voice, how silence can feel like a wound. Lewis was talking to the chaplain, who looked as though faith had worn him thin rather than fortified him. He spoke of the dead Manon of the college fellows, Dr. Peter Caldwell. Taught theology, lived alone in rooms above the quadrangle, fond of walking at night. I asked whether he was known to take his prayers to the chapel before dawn. The chaplain nodded slowly, said he was devout in the lonely way scholars sometimes face faith as an argument rather than a comfort. We found his Bible on the second pew, open not at the Psalms but the book of Job. The margins were scored with ink, thick and restless, a man arguing with God through the commentary of others. There was a verse underlined twice. The thing which I greatly feared is coming upon me. I could almost hear the scratch of the pen, the irritation behind it. Lewis said it meant nothing. I told him that was exactly why it meant something. Outside, the sky was clearing, thin light on the wet stones. I could hear the faint clatter of breakfast trays from the hall. I stood by the gate a moment, thinking of the bell that had called me earlier. Bell. The word on the note is still drying in my coat pocket. Not a coincidence, I thought, though coincidence is what the tired mind clings to when the pattern grows too large. The porter joined us, a man with the patience of stone. He told me Dr. Caldwell had been acting oddly of late, forgetting his keys, leaving the gate open, muttering to himself about someone watching. He'd received letters too, small cream envelopes without a return address. The porter said he'd burn them after reading, one each night for a week, on the steps outside the chapel. I asked how he knew. The porter shrugged ashes on the flagstones, a faint smell of sealing wax. Later in Caldwell's rooms I stood by the window overlooking the quad. Books everywhere, as if they had multiplied during the night. On the desk a notebook lay open beside a small brass inkstand. The last entry stopped mid-sentence, and so the psalm remains unfinished until a long dash, then nothing. I traced it with a fingertip, imagining the pen slipping as he looked up at some sudden sound. Lewis found a tape recorder on the shelf. He pressed play. A voice, hesitant, echoing slightly, the chapel's acoustics unmistakable. It was Caldwell reading from the psalm, his tone trembling not from faith, but fear. Out of the depths. Then the scrape of movement, a faint clatter, a sound that might have been the bell itself. The tape ended there, with static. We looked at each other in the grey morning light. There are moments in a case when deduction feels like trespass. I asked Lewis to take the recorder to the lab. He asked what I made of it, only that a man expecting redemption rarely carries a bell into a chapel at dawn. On my way out, I noticed the hymn board still marked with the previous evening's service number, Psalm 130. Someone had shifted the wooden digits slightly, the first and the third reversed. 310 instead of 130, a small thing, perhaps meaningless. Yet numbers, like prayers, have a way of concealing their own logic. When I stepped outside, the rain had stopped entirely. The bells of the city began again, overlapping, discordant. Somewhere among them I thought I heard one out of tune, a note slightly higher, impatient to be heard. I couldn't tell if it came from Lonsdale or from within my own head. Either way, the psalm was still unfinished. The choir stalls have always unnerved me. Their carved saints lean forward in perpetual witness, faces softened by centuries of prayer and indifference. That morning, the air was still thick with the faint sweetness of candle grease and damp wood. In the shuat, organist, a small man with long fingers and a cough that seemed to come from another era, was waiting for me. He said he'd been rehearsing when the echoes began. Not voices, he insisted, not music, either something between. Lewis gave him the kind of smile policemen use when they want a statement to end quickly. I let it linger instead. The man's hands kept twitching toward the keys, like a penitent returning to confession. I asked what piece he had been playing. He said, Purcell. Always Purcell. Something about order and dissonance, he added, as though that explained death itself. The chapel was darker than before. Only a single shaft of light escaped from the high window, falling across the pews like a silent accusation. I stood where Caldwell had fallen. The flagstones were dry now, though the faint outline of his body remained, a paler geometry on the floor. It reminded me of the chalk lines from my earliest cases, back when everything seemed more procedural and less human. Lewis said the forensic report was inconclusive, no sign of struggle, no trace of poison, nothing but a few faint abrasions on the wrist. Possibly self-inflicted, possibly not. The word possibly was doing far too much work. While Lewis noted measurements, I walked along the choir stalls. Someone had left a hymnal open on the ledge. The page was torn halfway down the spine, and a dark fingerprint smudged the margin beside the words, Lord, Thou hast been our refuge. I ran a finger over it. The print was old, perhaps Caldwell's, perhaps older still. I caught sight of something beneath the seat, a scrap of torn fabric, navy blue, smooth as silk. I pocketed it without comment. The organist had begun to play again, softly this time, as if to test whether sound itself could provoke the past into speaking. The notes trembled, rose, fell, then caught suddenly, like a man drawing breath in fear. I turned. His eyes were fixed, not on the keyboard, but on the far end of the chapel. It was the echo again, not quite repetition, not quite distortion, a sound that arrived a heartbeat late, as if space itself were remembering imperfectly. I walked toward the back. The source, if one could call it that, was a narrow wooden grill and old ventilation opening behind the stalls. Dust clung to it thickly. When I pressed my ear closer, I thought I heard movement beyond faint, rhythmic, measured. Steps on stone, then silence. Lewis called out, but the sound broke itself against the walls, returning to us in pieces. I told him to check the passage behind the choir. He muttered something about ghosts and drafts, but went. When he returned, his shoes left damp prints on the tiles. The corridor, he said, ended in a bricked-up doorway. No one had been there for years. I remained by the stalls, listening. It's strange how certain silences refuse to empty. Beneath the quiet surface there was something else, breathing, waiting, unspoken. I found myself looking again at the hymnal. The torn page was numbered 73. Psalm 73 begins with envy and ends with revelation. Caldwell had been a theologian. Perhaps he'd chosen his numbers as carefully as his arguments. Lewis asked if I believed in ghosts. I told him I believed in echoes, which are worse. They prove that sound exists longer than intention. He didn't quite understand, but he nodded all the same. As we left the chapel, the organ gave one last exhalation, unplayed, a note hanging in the air long after the player's hands had fallen still. It sounded, I thought, like something unresolved, half hymn, half cry. The kind of sound that makes a man turn around, certain someone has just whispered his name. The archives lay beneath the college library, a world below the world where silence was no longer the absence of sound but the presence of something waiting. The air tasted of paper and iron, and I slept. Lewis followed me reluctantly, his flashlight trembling against the stone walls as if afraid it might awaken something better left in the dark. We'd been told that Caldwell spent much of his time here, cataloguing obscure theological correspondence letters exchanged between forgotten clergymen who had argued God into exhaustion. The college archivist, a thin woman with eyes like smudged glass, met us at the door. She said he had been looking for a set of sealed letters, misfiled years ago, though she could not recall who sealed them or why. Her tone made me suspect she preferred not to remember. The shelves stretched into shadows. I ran my fingers along the labels: epistles, 1890-1899, parish accounts, donations. The lettering had faded to a ghostly brown. Somewhere behind us, a drip from a leaking pipe punctuated the silence. Lewis muttered that he hated basements. I said most truths live in basements. People just don't like the smell. On Caldwell's desk, a simple oak table under a green lamp lay, several folders bound with red tape. One had been opened and abandoned mid-study. Inside, yellowing sheets filled with a slanted hand, signed with a name I recognized only faintly: Harcourt. A minor theologian of the early century, a man rumoured to have left Oxford after some moral scandal never properly defined. I read the first letter slowly. It spoke of temptation, of the weight of knowing something unfit to confess, and of a student who had sought refuge in his rooms late one night, trembling. The language was coded, elliptical, like a man writing to God with one hand while erasing himself with the other. The last line caught me. You cannot hear the truth unless you are already listening for it. Lewis read over my shoulder, frowning. He said it sounded like nonsense. I thought otherwise. There was rhythm in it, psalm-like, deliberate. Caldwell's fascination with unfinished prayers, with the echo of faith rather than its sound, began to take on shape. Perhaps he had found in Harcourt a mirror of his own despair. Or perhaps the letters had been meant for someone else entirely. A drawer in the desk resisted when I tried to open it. Inside, among the clutter of index cards and ink bottles, lay an envelope unmarked except for a single initial B. The flap was sealed with old wax, the colour of dried blood. I turned it in the lamplight, noting the faint indentation of handwriting beneath the seal. Someone had written, then erased, a date. Lewis urged caution. He said we ought to log it properly, but his voice lacked conviction. I broke the seal gently. Inside were 3 pages, written in the same hand as the Harcourt letters, but these were unsigned. The first described a meeting in the chapel after dark. The second, a warning: do not ring the bell again. It will summon what cannot be dismissed. The third was blank except for one phrase, centered on the page, in darker ink, as if rewritten over and over. The psalm is unfinished because the prayer was never heard. The archivist returned with tea that neither of us wanted. I asked her if the name Harcourt meant anything. She hesitated, then said there had once been a Harcourt Fellowship discontinued after some controversy involving falsified donations. Caldwell had tried to revive it last year. She smiled faintly as though remembering something distasteful. When we left, I paused at the foot of the staircase and looked back at the shelves. The light from the lamp trembled across the rows of boxes, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw movement letters shifting, as though stirred by a breath too deep to belong to the living. Lewis said it was the drought. I said nothing. On the way out, the archivist locked the door and handed me the key by mistake. I returned it, but her fingers brushed mine, cold and dry as parchment. She said, almost absently, that Caldwell had come down here the night before he died. He'd stayed until the bell rang, then he never came back. There are cafes in Oxford that seem to exist outside of time rooms, where the steam from the kettle curls upward like an unanswered thought, and the voices never rise above a murmur. It was one of those places where Lewis and I sat that morning, the kind of establishment that survives only because no one remembers it ever opening. The waitress moved like someone underwater. The cups were chipped, the sugar in the bowls slightly damp. Lewis was reading the report again, trying to make sense of the silence between the words. He said Caldwell's autopsy had confirmed little to no poison, no signs of violence, and heart failure most likely. Natural causes. That phrase again, as if nature had taken to murder. He said it with that careful optimism people use when they want a case to end. I told him nothing in Oxford ever ends. It merely changes its disguise. Outside, rain clung to the windows like sweat. The city moved in slow motion, bicycles gliding past, umbrellas folding and unfolding with the rhythm of resignation. I stirred my tea until the liquid turned opaque. The waitress had left the spoon there too long. Its reflection distorted my face, turning it into something I didn't entirely recognize. Lewis asked about the letters we'd found. He thought they pointed to obsession, maybe madness. I thought otherwise. Obsession explains nothing. It only describes a shape. I told him Caldwell's fear wasn't madness, it was memory. Something in those archives had reminded him of a sin not his own. He frowned, waiting for more. I didn't offer it. There are deductions that feel too fragile to speak aloud. The phrase on the last page, the psalm unfinished, had begun to align itself with the pattern of his life. The bell, the letters, the quiet prayers muttered to no one. I'd seen the same thing in men who believed silence could protect them. It never did. Lewis went out for a cigarette. I stayed behind, tracing the condensation on the glass with my finger. Across the street stood a bookshop I used to frequent years ago before I knew the price of curiosity. The sign was the same flaking gold lettering, a door that never quite shut properly. I remembered buying a volume of Donne there, one line underlined by the previous owner. When thou hast done, thou hast not done. It was then that I noticed her. The archivist from the night before, standing by the window opposite, her face reflected in the rain-streaked glass. She wasn't looking at me, not exactly, but at something or someone behind her. A man in a dark coat lingered near the doorway, head bowed. She turned, spoke to him, and he stepped closer. I couldn't hear the words, but her body shifted with the rhythm of insistence, then fear. A moment later, she walked away while the man remained. Lewis returned, the smell of smoke clinging to him. I told him what I'd seen. He said perhaps it was nothing. I said perhaps it was everything. He laughed softly, as though humour might dilute the unease. We left soon after. The rain had thickened into something colder. As we passed the bookshop, I caught a glimpse through the window. The man in the dark coat was inside now, speaking to the shopkeeper, his hand resting on a stack of old hymnals. He looked up once, directly at me. His eyes were pale, unremarkable, the sort of eyes that forget and are forgotten. But there was something in the way he held himself, a stillness that felt deliberate, as though movement might betray him. Lewis asked if I knew him. I said not yet. Back at the station, I found myself staring again at the evidence, the letter marked B, the psalm, and the tape from the chapel. On impulse, I played the recording once more. The sound of Caldwell's voice filled the room, trembling at first, then breaking entirely. The scrape of the bell, faint, metallic, and beneath it, something else. A whisper lower than breath, barely audible but there. Words that might have been echo might have been answered. I poured another cup of tea that had long gone cold. Lewis was saying something about post-mortem timings, but I was listening to the silence between each word. The silence was heavier now, as though it had learned my name. It struck me then that truth, like music, depends not on the notes, but on the pauses. And somewhere between the bell and the breath, between prayer and echo, Caldwell had heard something he could not unhear. I left the recorder running. The room, after all, already knew how to listen. It was evening when I returned to the college, the kind of pale dusk that settles slowly, like thought reluctant to end. The rain had stopped, but the pavements still gleamed as if reflecting what could not be remembered. I found the chaplain in his room, a small set above the chapel, filled with the smell of wax and old sermons. He was sitting by the fire with a book unopened on his knee, the posture of a man pretending to read his own past. He didn't look surprised to see me. I sometimes think guilt has its own clairvoyance. He gestured toward a chair. I declined the whisky he offered, though the gesture itself was revealing he poured 2 glasses out of habit. Lewis waited in the corridor, restless as ever. I told him to give me 10 minutes. He said I'd need 20. The chaplain began to talk almost at once. His voice was careful, measured, the tone of someone accustomed to officiating at the boundary between truth and comfort. He said he had known Caldwell for years, since his student days, in fact. A bright mind, restless, too enamored of the idea that faith could be proved like geometry. He'd returned to Lonsdale as a fellow, determined to finish what he had begun, a paper on the nature of divine silence. I asked what that meant. He smiled in that clerical way, gentle, evasive. Caldwell believed silence was not absence, but evidence, that God's refusal to answer was itself an answer. The idea had obsessed him. He spent nights in the chapel, timing the echoes of the bell, recording his own prayers on tape. I'd heard one of those tapes, though I didn't say so. The memory of that breathless whisper still lingered in the corners of my mind. The chaplain went on. A few weeks before his death, Caldwell had come to him. Troubled, he spoke of letters he had found in the archives. Harcourt's letters, I said, and he flinched. I noticed the involuntary tremor of the hand, the smallest confession the body can give. He asked how I knew the name. I told him I had read them. The room felt smaller then. The fire crackled unevenly as though unwilling to witness what followed. He said Harcourt had once held his post here long ago and had been forced to resign after an indiscretion with a student. The scandal had been buried under theology and time. Caldwell had uncovered it while cataloguing donations, and in doing so had found something worse, a connection that shouldn't have existed. The student had not vanished as the records claimed. She had taken her vows in a convent nearby. The chaplain hesitated then, eyes lowered. Her name had been Beatrice. He paused, perhaps waiting for judgment. I gave him none. The glass in his hand was trembling now. He said Caldwell believed the bell in the chapel was once part of the convent's tower, that when it was transferred to Lonsdale after the dissolution, it brought with it a kind of inheritance. The unfinished psalm, the wrong echoes, the sense of something listening back. He said Caldwell had wrung it himself out of curiosity. I asked what happened afterward. He looked toward the window. There was no sound outside, not even the hum of the city. Caldwell had come to him 2 days later, pale, sleepless. He said the bell had answered, a single toll, though he hadn't touched the rope. After that, he'd refused to enter the chapel again. The chaplain had advised prayer. Caldwell had advised silence. I asked if he believed him. The chaplain smiled faintly. Belief is a profession, not a feeling, he said. Then he handed me an envelope from the table, addressed to me. My name written in the careful ink of a man who knew this moment would come. Inside, a single page, a verse, copied in Caldwell's hand. I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined unto me and heard my cry. Beneath it, a note in smaller writing, but not the second time. I folded it and stood. The chaplain looked older, smaller somehow, as if confession had drained him of mass. He said quietly that the bell hadn't rung since. I said nothing. When I stepped outside, the chapel door stood ajar. The faint scent of wax drifted into the damp air. I hesitated, listening, almost expecting the echo of a toll that would never sound again. Instead, there was only the creak of the rope in the stillness, a sigh perhaps, or the afterthought of faith. Lewis asked if I'd learned anything. I told him I'd learned the worst sound in Oxford is not a bell, but the silence that follows it. Lewis has never trusted the combination of religion and alcohol. He said so that evening as we crossed the quadrangle toward the Fellows' common room, the light failing over the wet grass. I told him the church had been built on wine, though perhaps not the kind we were about to taste. He muttered something about blasphemy and held his coat tighter. The wind was gathering again, sharp, unmusical, the kind that makes every decision feel premature. Inside, the fire was already burning, and 3 men were waiting with expressions of polite fatigue. The chaplain among them, his face now emptied of the earlier tremor, and 2 others, Dr. Cartwright, the bursar, and a historian, whose name I forget, but whose eyebrows could have written sermons on their own. They spoke of Caldwell as if he were still an inconvenience rather than a memory. It was the historian who poured the claret, deep red, almost ecclesiastical in tone. I took a seat near the window where I could see the chapel tower in silhouette. Lewis stood behind me, uneasy. Cartwright was explaining that the college had decided not to make a public statement. The inquest would be quiet. I said death in Oxford rarely is. He didn't reply, only refilled his glass. The conversation wandered funding, endowments, and a planned restoration of the library roof. All the while, I watched the chaplain. His eyes followed the rim of his cup as though it contained something prophetic. When he finally spoke, it was to tell a story about Caldwell's last evening. A small gathering, he said. Wine before Vespers, a tradition among the fellows. Caldwell had seemed distracted, almost impatient. He'd asked peculiar questions about the bell's history, whether it had ever been recast, whether its tone could be altered. The chaplain had laughed it off at the time. It was the historian who interrupted, saying he remembered that night differently. Caldwell had been angry, not distracted. He'd accused the college of hypocrisy, of burying the past with too much ceremony. He had mentioned Harcourt by name. The room quietened, the air thick with the scent of the claret. I asked if anyone else had heard him. No one answered. Lewis shifted behind me. He whispered that perhaps Caldwell had been drunk. I said drunkenness rarely invents new sins, it only revives the old ones. When the wine was nearly gone, I asked to see the cellar. Cartwright hesitated but obliged. We descended the narrow stairs, the walls sweating faintly in the damp. The air was heavy with cork and dust, A single bulb cast a feeble circle of light over the racks. I moved along them, tracing the years on the labels, 1945, 1957, 1963. The vintages were carefully arranged, too carefully. One rack bore the inscription, "For Vespers use only." Its bottles were older, darker, a few missing, from the top row. I asked who managed the cellar. Cartwright said the duty rotated among the fellows. Caldwell had done it the previous term. I lifted one of the bottles. Its cork was stained with an irregular bloom, purple, turning almost black. I felt along the rack roof edges where 2 bottles had been replaced recently. Lewis took note. There were smudges on the wood, faint but oily. Candle wax, perhaps, or something more deliberate. Back upstairs, the fire had died down. The chaplain was alone now, his cup half full, his gaze fixed on the smoke rising from the hearth. He looked at me and asked whether I believed in absolution. I told him it depended on the crime. He smiled faintly. Then he said something I've not forgotten. Silence, once invited, never leaves. It only waits to be refilled. I asked what Caldwell had wanted to fill it with. He said, redemption. Then he looked away, ashamed of the word. We left soon after. The night had deepened, the chapel bell motionless against the sky. Lewis asked what I'd been thinking down in the cellar. I told him Caldwell had been looking for a sound note only he could hear. A resonance between guilt and prayer. Lewis said he didn't follow. I said neither did Caldwell in the end. At the gate, I glanced back toward the tower. Somewhere within, the ropes hung ready for the next service, the next echo. I thought of the wine, the wax, the letters, folded like confessions, and I realized the psalm was never unfinished at all. It had simply changed hands. I found Professor Langley in his cluttered office, a room dimly lit by a single desk lamp that threw the stacks of books and papers into long, accusatory shadows. He looked up as I entered, calm, composed, but there was a tautness at the corner of his mouth that betrayed something more restless. Lewis waited outside, pretending to examine a corridor map, his presence necessary, yet peripheral. Langley gestured toward a chair. I declined and perched on the edge of the desk, letting my gaze roam over his walls. Photographs lined the shelves, Caldwell in robes, students holding prizes, the chapel in various states of decay and restoration. One photograph, however, stood out. It was framed, placed higher than the rest, and tilted slightly as though it had been moved recently. A group of fellows gathered around a bell tower. Among them, Caldwell alone, looked away from the camera, eyes fixed on the distant horizon. I asked him about the photograph. Langley hesitated, then explained that it had been taken 30 years ago before he joined Lonsdale. The bell in the background was the same that had troubled Caldwell in his final weeks. Its tone, he said, was famous for being inconsistent, uneven in the upper register. Musicians, even theologians, often commented on it. I noted the details, though I didn't comment aloud. Langley poured himself a glass of water, the gesture nervous, deliberate. He said Caldwell had been obsessed not only with the bell, but with its provenance. The man had believed it carried echoes from its previous owners, that the sound was not merely metallic, but moral. He had tracked down letters, photographs, and records, piecing together the lives that had touched the bell before its installation at Lonsdale. I asked if he thought Caldwell had been disturbed by this knowledge. Langley's eyes narrowed. Disturbed, perhaps, but obsession is rarely so simple. Caldwell had been meticulous, cautious even until the last week, when something did not know what had caused him to act impulsively. He had requested that Langley examine certain photographs in the college archives. I leaned closer, noting the weight of the silence between the words. I asked which photographs. Langley opened a drawer and retrieved a small stack, slightly warped by time. Among them, one caught my attention immediately. It was a cropped version of the framed picture on his wall, but with an extra figure at the edge, partially hidden by a woman in a dark coat, her hand resting on the bell tower railing. I knew her immediately from the archivist, Beatrice. She had been present at events Caldwell had believed private, known to him only through rumour and letters. Langley spoke almost to himself about timing, shadows, and perspective. I realized that Caldwell had noticed this figure years before, yet the key photograph had remained unexamined until recently. Someone had removed it from its album, intentionally or not. I examined the corners, faint fingerprint smudges, and a crease in the lower left, suggesting frequent handling. I asked why he hadn't mentioned it sooner. Langley said he had thought it irrelevant until Caldwell became fixated on Harcourt and the bell. The connection had grown too complex, too uncomfortable. I noted the subtle hesitation in his voice. Professors rarely falter without cause. Before leaving, I traced the line of sight in the photograph from Caldwell's eyes to the horizon, to Beatrice at the bell. Something about the angle suggested he had been aware, yet powerless, a witness trapped in time. The photograph, small and innocuous, had become an argument of its own. As I stepped out into the night, Lewis remarked that old images rarely held new truths. I told him they do, provided someone remembers to look closely. The bell tower loomed behind the chapel, silent yet accusing, and somewhere within its shadow, the next echo waited. I arrived at the music room late in the afternoon, when the sun had begun to slide behind the quadrangle, turning the cloisters into a lattice of shadow and amber. The door creaked under my hand, familiar in its uneven hinges, and the smell of polished wood and damp vellum hit me like a memory. Lewis lingered outside, as usual, taking note of the time rather than the sound of it. The organist was there, sitting at the keys, his back straight, fingers poised yet still. He played a single note high that hung in the room and refused to fade. I asked him why. He said it had sounded wrong when he struck it that morning, and he wanted to hear it alone, in context. I nodded. Some sounds demand patience before they reveal their secret. I walked along the rows of empty benches. Caldwell's absence was palpable, like a missing chord in a composition you thought you knew. I noticed the hymnal lying open near the lectern. One page turned hastily, the ink smudged at the margin. Someone had written a single word in the corner, "Listen." The handwriting was faint, precise. My mind traced it back to the letters in the archives, to the psalms left unfinished, to the faint note of a bell that had begun it all. Lewis entered quietly. He asked if I was certain this mattered. I said every note matters, even the wrong ones, even those that sound out of key. The organist began again, slowly, fingering the keys as if coaxing the instrument to remember something it had nearly forgotten. The note changed subtly, the C sharpening into something that sounded almost like a warning. I bent closer to the pedals and noticed a small smear on the wood, barely visible in the fading light. Candle wax? Possibly. Or perhaps something left behind by someone who had practiced here, unseen. I asked the organist about Caldwell's presence in the room that morning. He said he had arrived early, as usual, and found the psalm book on the altar lectern. Caldwell had spoken of the bell, of its resonance, of its history. Then he paused, staring at the page as though listening for a reply. The organist had left him for a few minutes, and when he returned, Caldwell was gone. Not walking, not leaving the building, gone. I crouched to examine the notes scrawled in the margin. A small error in the rhythm indicated a pause where none should have existed. The fingering for the passage was correct, yet the articulation was off. Someone had played the piece imperfectly, deliberately, or in the shadow of distraction. I could not tell which, but it suggested presence, observation, and interruption. Lewis asked if I thought it meant anything. I said only that it was a signature, a trace. Someone had left a mark for those who cared to notice. I moved to the window. Outside, the chapel tower glowed faintly in the last light. The bell rope swayed slightly, though no one had touched it. I traced the angle of its shadow across the courtyard and compared it to the line of sight from the organ. The pattern was subtle, but precise. Caldwell, the bell, and now the organist's note, all aligned in a rhythm that suggested anticipation. Someone had been counting, measuring, marking time in ways no one else could see. As the room darkened, the final note lingered, unclaimed, unresolved. I leaned back against the wall and let it resonate through me. The psalm, the bell, the note out of Kayit was all part of a narrative too delicate to speak aloud. Lewis asked again if I was certain it mattered. I said only that music does not lie, even when it bends under the weight of secrecy. We left in silence, the last note fading behind us. The chapel tower stood as still as ever, yet I could almost hear it breathe. Somewhere within, the unfinished psalm waited for its conclusion. The day began, as it always did, after matins, with a fragile hush that spread across the quadrangle, brushing the rooftops and cloisters with a pale indifference. I walked slowly, boots muffled against the damp stones, each step measured, as though pacing could stretch out the silence until it spoke. Lewis trailed behind me, hands in pockets, his habitual restlessness muted by the weight of expectation. Inside the chapel, the candles were still smouldering from the morning service, their wax pools like tiny lakes reflecting the arching timbers. The psalms had ended, the choir's voices dissolved into echoes that clung stubbornly to the stone walls. I ran my fingers over the edges of the hymnals left open on the pews, noting the crease of a page, the slight indentation of a finger at a margin. Someone had read this passage recently, carefully, deliberately. The chaplain was seated in his usual corner, head bowed, hands folded as though he could hold the day in prayer. He looked up when I approached, and there was a tension in his eyes I had not noticed before. I asked about the events since Caldwell's death, and he said quietly that everything was proceeding with the decorum expected of Lonsdale. Yet his voice carried a tremor that betrayed the unease beneath the calm. Lewis whispered from behind, noting the air of restraint in the room. I said that silence, like music, has its own punctuation, and we were beginning to see the commas and ellipses between the chords. I moved toward the lectern, observing the bell rope dangling without motion. Its shadow stretched across the floor, touching the edges of the pews as if searching for something absent. The chaplain spoke of Caldwell again, of his devotion, his meticulousness, the obsession with the bell and its echoes. He mentioned letters, the photograph of Beatrice, the alignment of the fellows around the tower, in Longargo images. I traced these details in my mind like notes on a page, assembling an argument of absence and presence. The silence was interrupted by faint, creak footsteps, though no one entered. I looked toward the door. Lewis had not moved. The sound came again, deliberate, a rhythm almost imperceptible. I followed it with my ears to the walls, along the columns. It ended at the back, near the vestry, where the shadows pooled deep. I bent down, inspecting the floor. There, a faint scuff mark, nearly invisible in the dim light. A shoe dragged backward slightly. The detail was small, yet unmistakable. Someone had been here, walked carefully around the pews, and left this trace a gesture, overlooked, but enough to speak across the silence. I asked the chaplain if anyone had accessed the vestry in the past week. He hesitated, and then mentioned an unscheduled visiting historian seeking records. His pause was longer than necessary. I did not press, only noted the length of it. The organist arrived, quietly, as though summoned by instinct rather than invitation. He had brought a sheet of music, Caldwell's last transcription of the psalm. The note at the top, a single word underlined, "Listen." I traced it with my finger. It felt like a clue, a breadcrumb left for anyone attuned to nuance. I asked the chaplain if he had noticed the organist at the vestry. He said no, yet the angle of the notes, the way the ink bled across the page, suggested observation, deliberate timing. Someone had orchestrated attention, aligning the psalm, the bell, and the traces on the floor. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing the tower and cloisters. The silence of matins lingered like a presence, expanding and contracting, waiting for comprehension. Lewis murmured that he could not see the significance. I said significance is often the child of patience and careful listening. I left the chapel, the notes folded and tucked away. Behind me, the bell remained still, its rope swaying faintly as though sighing. I knew, as I often do, that in Oxford the echoes outlast the sound, and that the silence after matins could be more revealing than any cry. As we crossed the quadrangle, I glanced back once more. The shadow of the tower stretched over the wet stones, touching the footprints we had left behind. Somewhere in the stillness the psalm waited, unfinished, yet insistently present, as if the day itself demanded its conclusion.